Chapter 2. The King's Last Stand. By the time Kael found King Aldrin's host, winter had given way to a raw, wet spring that turned roads into trenches and fields into sucking brown waste. Weeks of marching east and south had worn the army lean. Cloaks were patched with enemy cloth, boots bound in cord, shields scarred white where axes had bitten. Yet the king still rode the lines each morning in practical plate darkened by rain, iron-gray beard beaded with water, speaking to pikemen and mule drivers with the same grave attention he gave his captains. Men straightened when he passed. They still believed decent order could hold. Kael, marching again under a banner he no longer loved, believed only that the enemy king had a throat like any other man. The two armies drew toward each other, between the river and a line of low hills stripped bare by foragers. Scouts came back with stories that changed in every telling. Black standards, dead men walking, fires that burned green in the night. But the facts were enough. The enemy had crossed sooner than expected and taken the ridge road. If Aldrin failed here, the road to the heartland lay open. Kael listened in the sergeant's ring, saying little. He had no taste for camp rumors, only for ground, distance, and timing. The left would bog near the riverbank, the center would take the first hammering. The king meant to break them with a hard push uphill before their sorcerers could settle to work. It was a soldier's plan, honest and dangerous. That night, Kael sat by a low fire with whetstone and sword, drawing the edge slow and even, while rain hissed in the ash. Around him men muttered of pay, saints, and whether dawn would find them alive. He thought of Mara only once, and even that he cut short. Grief had become a tool if he kept it sharp. Across the dark, beyond the pickets and the wet fields, waited the ruler whose war had burned villages, broken kingdoms, and made carrion of decent men. Kael touched the ring beneath his tunic, not in tenderness now, but as a reminder. Tomorrow, if the lines broke and fortune opened a path, he would go through steel, mud, and any number of bodies to reach that king. At dawn, the army showed its true size. As the mist lifted off the plain, banners emerged in strips of color from every road and fold of ground. Stag, tower, sheaf, red hand, the white gulls of the western marsh lords, each with its knot of men, wagons, and spare horses dragging through the mud to join Aldrin's line. What had seemed in darkness a single tired host resolved into a country gathered under strain. Smiths worked beside field altars. Teamsters cursed at axle-deep ruts. Heralds rode between commands with cloaks plastered to their backs. Kael stood on a low rise with the king's outriders and counted by habit. Pike blocks thickening the center, archers massed where the ground held firm, cavalry held back on the right where the slope offered a chance at speed. Enough men to make a battle worthy of songs, and enough dead to feed crows for a week if the songs lied. King Aldrin rode up the ridge with little escort fuss, his rain-dark plate plain but well kept, his iron-gray beard tucked close against the wind. He reined in near the captains and looked over the field with the face of a man measuring cost, not glory. "Ironhand," he said, seeing Kael among them. Not captain now, not sergeant, just the old name from harder campaigns. Several captains glanced over. Kael bowed his head once. Aldrin had always remembered the men he could use. "You broke the gate at Han," the king said, "and held the breach at Seer Hollow."
"With others, sire."
"With enough left alive because you were there." Aldrin pointed with a gauntleted hand toward the forward command standard planted below the ridge. "Stay near my line today." It was not honor. Kael knew that much. Men were placed where they could do the most damage before they died, and Kael's name had traveled farther than he liked. Around him, younger nobles glanced over with that mix of curiosity and caution reserved for soldiers who had survived too much and risen without inheritance. One of them, bright-crested and smooth-cheeked, studied him as if expecting legend to have left a scar. Kael gave him none. He checked the strap on his shield, the fit of his sword belt, the wax string of the bow at his back. Reputation was only a promise other men made for you. By noon, the field would decide whether it had lied. Below, the king's standard lifted above the wet morning, a plain crown over a river, modest beside the gaudier devices of his lords. Kael looked at it longer than he meant to. He had come to carry hard truth into command tents and, if chance allowed, to hunt the enemy king through the wreck of battle. Instead, he felt himself pulled back into the old shape of service by the one man in the realm whose authority did not stink of vanity or fear. That was dangerous. Loyalty made demands, revenge did not. When the horn sounded assembly across the plain, Kael went down the slope toward Aldrin's forward line, not because he trusted kings again, but because this one was still worth standing beside. Rain came and went in thin veils all morning. Between showers, King Aldrin rode the front at a walk, not with trumpets or a knot of jeweled courtiers, but with two bannermen, a clerk under oilskin, and a surgeon's cart struggling in the ruts behind. He stopped where boots were worst and tempers shortest. Kael watched him speak to a pikeman with a bandaged hand, to a carter whose mule had gone lame, to 3 boys from the western marshes trying not to stare at the king. Aldrin knew names often enough to shame the officers who did not. When he did not know them, he asked and listened to the answer, as if it mattered. Men straightened under that attention. They would still die when ordered, but not with the look of men already wasted by neglect before battle had even begun. Near midday, the king reined in by the forward ditch where Kael stood with the reserve files. Mud had dried in a fan across Aldrin's greaves. His lined face looked older up close, the skin around his eyes drawn by too many short nights, yet nothing in him had gone soft. "Ironhand," he said again, and this time there was the ghost of recognition beyond utility.
"I heard what was done to your village."
Kael kept his expression flat.
"To many villages, sire."
Aldrin held his gaze a moment, understanding the correction and accepting it.
"Many,"
he said.
"If we fail here, there will be more."
He looked east, toward the low ridge where the enemy standard showed black through the mist.
"I would rather spend men than lie to them. Hold when the center buckles. Buy me 1 clean hour."
It was a hard thing to ask so plainly, and because it was plain, Kael believed him. No promise of easy victory, no priest's blessing dressed as strategy. 1 hour. Enough time to turn a flank, enough time to save the road, enough time to bury another 1,000 men under honest orders. Kael bowed his head once.
You'll have it.
Aldrin moved on, speaking next to a spearman no one of rank had reason to notice. Kael watched the king go and felt, against his will, the old chain settle across his shoulders again. Duty, not as a word shouted over drums, but as a debt owed to a man who had not hidden from its cost. Across the field, beyond the wet banners and the waiting ridge, lay the other king, whispered of at campfires as a dealer in grave dirt miracles and counsel bought from things better left under stone. Kael found that he wanted him dead for more than Mara now. By late afternoon, the scouts began to come in for good, not straggling pairs with mud to their knees and half-heard rumors, but hard riders sent straight to the command fire. Kael stood at the edge of the king's circle while they gave their reports. One had lost his horse and come back on another man's saddle, face gray with cold and strain. He said the enemy camp had shifted after noon without trumpet or shouted order, whole files changing place behind the ridge, as if guided by some unseen hand. Another swore the black standards had been planted in a new line 3 times before dusk, each time farther apart than the ground should allow. A third, an old border scout not given to fancy, said he had watched lights move among the enemy tents where no lanterns ought to be. Green at first, then white as forge heat, low to the earth and steady as they drifted between the rows.
Not men carrying them. They move too smooth for that.
No one laughed at him. The captains argued in clipped, tired voices.
Pull back to the river. Refuse the left flank. Wait a day and force the enemy to come down.
Aldrin listened with both hands braced on the wet map table, rain ticking on the leather stretched over it. At last he straightened.
If we yield the ridge road, they are through the border forts before week's end.
He looked from lord to lord, not sparing them.
You know what lies behind us. Farms, market towns, villages with no walls. We do not buy safety by stepping aside. We buy slaughter somewhere else.
The bright-crested young noble opened his mouth, then shut it. No one had a cleaner answer. Dusk fell early and mean. Across the plain, the enemy camp showed almost no common fire, only those wrong lights glimmering now and then through the mist, pale as moonlight under deep water. Men noticed, horses noticed more. Lines of tethered mounts rolled their eyes and pulled at the pickets until grooms cursed and struck them quiet. Kael watched the far ridge and felt an old soldier's warning prickle between his shoulders. This was bad ground, bad weather, and something worse than either waiting in the dark. Yet when Aldrin gave the order to stand ready for battle at first light, Kael found no relief in it and no objection either. Retreat would save the army for a day, and spend the country instead. Some choices were made only because the others were worse. Night settled. The king's clerks carried the orders out under hooded lamps. Priests moved among the companies with oil and murmured blessings that sounded thin in the damp air. Kael sat on an overturned grain cask near the reserve fires, whetstone in hand again, though his sword no longer needed it. Around him men spoke lower than before. He thought of the scouts' faces, of Aldrin's plain refusal to hide from consequence, and of the unseen ruler beyond the ridge who had taught an army to move like a bad dream. He had ridden here for vengeance. On the eve of battle, that purpose had narrowed into something meaner. If the enemy king brought sorcery onto this field, Kael would ride through it all the same. Some debts could be paid only by going close enough to death to look it in the face. Rain tapped on the stretched hide above the reserve fire and ran in black threads off the wagon wheels. Kael sat on an upturned cask with his sword across his knees, drawing the whetstone from hilt to tip in slow, even passes. The blade had already taken its edge. He kept at it for discipline, not need. Around him, men checked straps, muttered prayers, pissed into the dark, and tried to laugh as if mourning were a thing like any other. Kael ignored them. He watched the steel catch the firelight and thought of all the lives a sword could not save in time. At last he set the stone aside and tested the edge with his thumb. Good. He wiped the blade dry, though the damp would creep back within minutes, and slid it home. His hand went under his tunic almost without thought. The ring hung where it always did, warm from his skin, the chain worn smooth by weeks of handling. He closed his fist around it until the edges bit his palm. Mara's hand had been small, deft, browned by summer work in the garden behind their house. He held to that and refused the rest. If he let memory open fully, it would take the field from him before the enemy ever tried. Across the plain, beyond the mist, a pale light moved once and vanished. Not campfire, not lantern. Men nearby saw it and fell quiet. Kael looked up and felt the old hard part of himself settle into place. He could not raise burned beams. He could not call back his wife, or the children from the lane, or the farmers cut down because kings wanted roads and tribute. The dead were beyond him, the living were not. He stood and buckled on his sword belt. Mud clung to his boots. Rain silvered the stubble on his jaw. He touched the ring one last time, pressing it hard into his palm. If dawn broke the line, he would hold until Aldrin gave the order. If the line failed anyway, he would go through the wreck toward the black standards and the man behind them. He had come too late to save anyone. He was not too late to kill. Dawn came thin and colorless, more a lifting of black than the arrival of light. The field between river and ridge showed itself by degrees. Old spear shafts jutting from the mud, broken cart rims half sunk from some earlier campaign. A scatter of bones worked pale by weather where the crows had missed their due. Men formed around such wreckage because the ground offered no cleaner place. Aldrin's host dressed its line in silence, broken by harness buckles, coughs, and the bark of sergeants forcing files straight. Pike heads rose in a wet gray forest. Archers stamped feeling back into their feet. Standard bearers stripped damp wrappings from the poles and raised the realm's colors into the raw morning, the banners hanging heavy with rain. Priests moved before the ranks with oil, ash, and river water, marking brows and shield rims, and giving blessings that sounded practical rather than grand. Kael had heard finer prayers from men who ran first. He stood in the reserve near the king's standard, helm under one arm, shield strapped, sword loose in the scabbard. Around him, younger soldiers watched the priests as if a thumbprint of ash could stop a spear. He watched the officers instead. He marked which captains checked their flanks, which shouted too much, and which men glanced at the ridge when they thought no one saw. Fear was useful when it kept a man in line. King Aldrin rode the front once more on a dark bay horse splashed to the belly with mud. His practical plate was plain beside the gilded harness of his lords, his iron-gray beard wet with mist, his face lined and set. He did not waste words.
Dress on the river. Hold for the horn. No one chases a broken enemy without my order.
Men listened because he spoke like survival was still possible. When he reached Kael, he reined in only long enough to say,
1 hour.
Kael answered,
Yes, sire.
and nothing more. It was enough. Across the field, the enemy ranks emerged through the thinning mist in disciplined black bands along the ridge road. Their standards did not dip in the wind. Between them burned a few low lights, green-white and steady, wrong against the morning. Horses rolled their eyes and sidled from them. Kael sat on his helm and felt the world narrow to iron, breath, and distance. The lights on the ridge were no camp trick. Whatever began here would not end like an ordinary battle. The first arrows came with a sound like rain finding leaves. They hissed out of the ridge mist and struck all along Aldrin's front. Shields, mud, horseflesh, men. A marsh archer 2 files ahead of Kael took one through the throat and folded without a cry. Another shaft glanced from Kael's shield rim and spun away. Before the volleys had finished, horns answered from the enemy right. Dark cavalry spilled down the slope in a wedge, lances low, barding black with wet. They had chosen the soft ground where Aldrin's left bent toward the river, trusting weight and panic to finish what the arrows had begun.
Reserve with me.
Kael snapped, already moving. No herald repeated the order. The nearest files came because his voice carried the kind of command men obeyed before thinking. He ran through churned mud toward the threatened flank, 6 mounted retainers and 24 foot at his back, all that could be gathered in heartbeats. Ahead, the left line shuddered as the first impact landed. Horses crashed into pikes. Men vanished under hooves. A banner dipped and did not rise. Kael reached the gap as one rider broke through, sword high, his face hidden behind a black nasal helm. Kael stepped inside the swing and drove his blade up under the man's arm. Hot blood sheeted over his gauntlet. He ripped the sword free, seized the falling rider's harness, and heaved the corpse sideways to foul the charge behind.
Brace. 3 deep.
He roared. The footmen locked in around him with the reflex of drilled veterans, shields overlapping, spear points thrust through the seams. A horse screamed as it impaled itself and toppled, throwing its rider into the wall of iron. Kael stamped on the man's wrist until it broke, then drove his blade through the visor before the next impact. To his right, one of Aldrin's young nobles was being dragged from the saddle with a hooked pole. Kael cut the pole haft in 2, caught the noble's reins, and slapped the panicked horse back toward friendly ground.
Stay behind the line if you want to grow old,
he said, and turned before thanks could waste breath. The countercharge landed not with glory, but with timing. Aldrin's reserve cavalry held back until the enemy wedge lost shape in bodies and broken pikes, slammed into its exposed flank. Kael saw the moment and drove his footmen forward 3 hard steps, enough to pin the black riders between shield wall and cavalry. Discipline did what fury could not. Men died screaming in the crush. Mounts kicked themselves lame. The enemy standard on the left went down into the mud. Kael stood in the middle of it, breathing blood and wet earth, and knew 2 things at once. The line had held, and this was only the opening exchange. The enemy should have broken by now. Kael knew the signs. The first shock spent, horses balking at the press, men looking over shoulders for room to run. Instead, the black-armored riders and the infantry behind them came on with a steadiness that turned the stomach. A spearman with half his cheek laid open took 2 more steps after Kael slashed him, thrust once, and only fell when a 3rd blow split his collarbone. Another fought with an arrow buried to the feathers in his side, his face slack as wet clay, until Fen marshmen dragged him down and hacked through his neck. There was no battle cry left in that part of the field now, only grunts, iron on iron, and the ugly wet sounds of men being opened. The enemy made those sounds and kept advancing anyway.
Drugged.
Gasped one of Kael's footmen, spitting blood through broken teeth.
They're drugged.
Kael did not answer. He had seen men on poppy resin before, border raiders too numb or mad to feel a knife at once. This was not that. These soldiers did not rage or froth. They fought with dead patience, as if someone had stripped pain from them and fear with it. Behind their line, low on the ridge, green-white lights still burned in daylight. Not lanterns, not reflections off steel, fixed points, cold and steady. And every time Kael's eyes found them, the hairs rose on the back of his neck. Aldrin's horn sounded. The center was to advance and dress the torn left. Kael shoved his men forward through bodies and broken shafts, carving space where the line threatened to buckle again. He cut down a standard-bearer whose guts already spilled over his belt and had to wrench the blade free of bone. Even dead, the man still clutched the staff. To Kael's left, a young levy froze at the sight and lost his shield. Kael caught him by the shoulder, slammed him back into place and said,
"Look at me, not at them."
The boy obeyed. Good. Fear could still be commanded on this side. But command was thinning across the line. All along the field, men had begun to notice what should not be possible. Whispers moved even through the clash. Grave magic, corpse priests, the Black King's bargain. Kael heard them and hated that none sounded foolish anymore. When the next enemy rank came on over their own dead, stepping on fallen comrades without a glance, he understood the battle had shifted onto worse ground than mud. Steel still mattered. Courage still mattered. But something else had come onto the field, and beside it, ordinary valor looked small. Kael drove with the reserve into the place where the enemy's center had thinned, using the wrecked wagons on the left as cover for a harder thrust. His shield was split near the rim. He cast it aside and went to two hands on the sword. The men behind him were veterans now, because the others were dead, and they moved when he moved. They punched through a knot of black spears, overran archers trying to knock at arm's length, and for 20 brutal yards the field made sense again. Kill the man in front of you. Step over him. Keep the line dressed. Kael saw daylight between enemy files and shouted for the push. A gap opened toward the ridge road, narrow but real. Then 3 horns sounded at once from different parts of Aldrin's line, each calling a different order. Advance, wheel right, fall back. Men hesitated in the middle of killing. On the king's side, a banner rose through the murk and dipped twice, the signal to hold. Yet another standard farther off was already retreating toward the river. Smoke rolled low across the field, too thick and sudden for wet ground, stinging the eyes and bleaching friend and foe into shapes with steel in their hands. Kael paused to listen, and that nearly killed him. A black-clad axeman burst from the smoke and buried his axe in the shoulder of the man beside him. Kael caught the axeman down and bellowed,
"On me. Ignore the horns."
An hour later it might be called treason. Here it was survival. His wedge kept moving, but the battle around it came apart. Through rents in the smoke he glimpsed Aldrin's circlet near the center, the old king still mounted, still trying to dress a line that no longer knew its own edges. Kael felt the danger at once. This was no simple confusion of weather and fear. Someone was breaking command, turning discipline into a weapon against them. He could press the gap and reach the ridge road, perhaps even the enemy camp, or turn back toward the king before the center collapsed. For one stride he hated the choice. On the next he made it.
"Back to the standard,"
he said, and his men stared as if he had ordered them into a fire. Perhaps he had. Kael wiped blood from his eyes with the back of his gauntlet and turned toward the smoke where Aldrin's banner vanished and surfaced again. The road to vengeance lay open ahead. He left it behind. Kael had covered perhaps 30 paces toward Aldrin's standard when the center of the field turned black. Not smoke. Smoke drifted and thinned. This rose in a single hard bloom from the press around the king. A column of darkness shot through with dull red, like banked coals under ash. Men nearest it vanished from sight. The sound came a heartbeat later, a deep crack felt in the ribs before it reached the ear. Horses screamed. One of Kael's veterans dropped his sword and clapped both hands over his face, though nothing had touched him. Another simply turned and ran. The line, which had bent and held all morning, tore open at that one wound.
Forward!
Kael roared, and heard how small one human voice was against panic. Shapes burst from the black surge. Enemy infantry in wet dark mail, shields locked, driving into the gap before Aldrin's captains could mark its edges. They came fast and orderly, using terror as good soldiers used terrain. Kael met the first rank at a dead run and smashed through a shield boss with a two-handed cut, then opened the man behind it from shoulder to hip. His own men crashed in around him, too few, cursing now instead of shouting. To the left, Royal infantry backed away from empty air, eyes wide, opening the line with every step. An enemy spear took one in the throat. Another stumbled over a corpse and was trampled by his own side. Through a rent in the dark, Kael saw Aldrin's horse rear, one flank blackened, as if scorched by heat that left no flame. The king was still in the saddle, iron-gray beard stark against his wet face, striking down at men pressing his guard. Good. While Aldrin lived, he could still be reached. Kael drove toward him, hacking for space, but the gap widened faster than he could close it. Standards dipped. Officers vanished. Men who had stood under arrows and cavalry now threw down pikes and clawed backward from that stain in the air. Kael understood then that this was not simple fear. Something was breaking the men where they stood. Whatever the Black King had loosed into the center had done in seconds what a morning of slaughter had failed to do. He killed another spearman, shoved a fleeing levy back toward the fight, and saw the truth plain as steel. If Aldrin fell here, the army would not retreat in order. It would come apart and be butchered where it stood. Kael caught a retreating pikeman by the front of his jack and slammed him against a shattered cart.
Look at me.
The man's eyes rolled white in a face gray with mud and ash. Kael struck the side of his helm with the flat of his hand.
You run now. You die tired. Dress on me, and you may yet make them pay first.
It was not noble, but the man's breathing steadied. Around them, others wavered in that narrow space between obedience and rout. Kael pointed with his sword.
Shields here. Pike heads through. You, horn if you still have wind. Call hold.
A few listened because plain commands still carried weight. More listened when Kael stepped into the gap himself and left them no room to mistake standing fast for courage. They formed badly. 6 shields where there should have been 20, pikes uneven, one archer clutching a wood axe because he had lost his bow. It was enough to stop the first rush. An enemy swordsman hit the line and died on 3 points. Another climbed over him and took Kael's blade in the mouth. Kael kicked the body free and kept shouting names of formations, old drill words, anything familiar enough to nail frightened men to the earth. For a moment the ground held. Through the thinning edge of the black column, he saw the royal standard ahead, lower than before. The knot of gilded helms around it had shrunk to a ragged crescent. One horse stood riderless with its throat opened. Another of the king's guard was on his knees, trying to rise with a broken spearhead buried in his belly. But the king himself Kael could not see. The standard dipped behind a press of black shields, rose again, and vanished in smoke and men. A sound went up from that quarter. Not one cry, but many, each cut short. The royal guard was folding inward, piece by piece, as if the thing they had been built around was no longer there. Kael felt the men beside him register it too. Their line loosened.
If he lives, he needs us.
Kael said, and hated that he could not make it certainty. He snatched up the fallen banner from a dead lieutenant, rammed its staff into the stunned pikeman's hands, and pointed toward the collapsing center.
Forward. Slow and together.
He did not believe they would all obey. He went anyway. After one hard breath, enough of them followed to matter. The ground around the royal standard was a butcher's yard of churned mud, blood, and broken men. Kael found Aldrin at last beside the king's horse, not in the saddle, but pinned beneath the carcass, one leg crushed under its weight. The old king's helm was gone. Blood ran from his ear and soaked the fur at his collar. 2 guards still stood over him, both bleeding badly, both near death by the look of them. They held because duty was all that remained. Kael and his handful of survivors crashed into the ring of black shields with the force of men too far gone to fear what came next. He split one man's face to the teeth, drove his shoulder into another, and dropped to one knee beside Aldrin. The king's eyes found him at once, still clear enough to understand exactly how lost the field was.
Too late for me.
Aldrin said, each word dragged through blood.
Not for him.
His gauntlet closed on Kael's wrist with surprising strength.
The ridge.
He rasped.
Their king. End it there.
Kael rose from the king's side with Aldrin's blood slick on his gauntlet and gave the order anyway.
With me.
12 men were left close enough to hear him, veterans and strays held together by terror and habit. They heaved the dead horse just enough for 2 guards to drag Aldrin clear, and Kael did not look back to see whether the king still breathed. Looking back was how men died. He drove toward the ridge through the seam his charge had torn in the enemy line, and for a few dozen paces the battle narrowed into work. Cut, step, guard, kill. The black-armored troops before the camp were different from the others. Better armor, longer blades, no wasted movement. They gave ground only to funnel his men between overturned supply carts and a ditch choked with rainwater and corpses. The killing turned one-sided there. A hammerman from Fenmarsh took a spear under the arm and kept swinging until a second thrust opened his throat. The young Levy Kael had steadied earlier lost half his face to a hooked axe and dropped without a sound. One of Aldrin's guards, limping on a ruined knee, locked shields with an enemy captain so Kael could get inside and split the man from collar to breastbone. When Kael turned, the guard had 3 knives in him and was sinking into the mud. The ridge camp loomed above them through smoke. Dark pavilions, sharpened stakes, the pale hide of command tents, and it looked close enough to touch. Kael understood the trap and pressed on anyway. If the enemy king stood ahead, every death bought a chance retreat never would. If he did not, these men were dying for nothing. He hated that he could no longer tell which it was. A black-helmed swordsman came at him with a duelist's calm. Kael broke the man's wrist on the bind, smashed his pommel into the man's mouth, and cut him down. But while he did it, 2 more men died on the flanks. 7 now. No, 6. They reached the first ring of stakes and found the elite guard waiting in silence, shields lacquered black, spear points bright as frost. Behind them, beyond a parted tent flap, green-white light burned steady in daylight. Old instinct told Kael to halt, dress ranks, think. Aldrin's last words drove him forward instead. He lowered his shoulder, raised his sword, and led what remained into the teeth of it. The first rank of black shields broke under the weight of men who had already chosen death over stopping. Kael went through the gap they made and into the outer campworks, boots slipping on trampled canvas and wet ash. The place beyond did not look like a command post under attack. It looked abandoned in the middle of some urgent work. Braziers lay overturned, their coals hissing in the rain. Rich pavilion silks had been ripped from their poles and left half dragging in the mud, crimson and cream gone dark with water. A map table stood with its legs smashed, not by stray blows, but as if someone had kicked it apart in haste. Around it, the ground was marked in white powder and black blood, circles crossed by sharp angles. Kael did not know, and did not care to learn. One of the men behind him muttered a prayer.
Please, God, help us.
Another said,
Where are they?
in the flat voice of someone who had expected a command tent and found a grave pit instead. Kael did not answer. He saw details because that was what had kept him alive this long. Wagon ruts fresh enough that rainwater still lay clean in them, a chest split open and emptied, tent pegs pulled rather than cut, no cooking gear left behind. Not rout, withdrawal. Deliberate, fast, and protected by the slaughter below. They had not stumbled into the enemy's heart. They had arrived after it had been moved. A body lay near the largest pavilion, face down in black mail, the back of the skull split cleanly. Not killed by Aldrin's men. Executed by his own, Kael guessed. Too slow, or he had seen too much. Beside the corpse sat a silver bowl of cloudy water, untouched by mud. In it lay a strip of linen wrapped around something small. Kael felt the men bunch behind him, waiting for the next order, and hated them for it because he had none worth giving. Beyond the torn pavilion flap, green-white light burned steady as a lantern in a cellar. Kael tightened his grip on the sword and went toward it, not because he thought Aldrin's charge could still be fulfilled, but because turning back would mean admitting the dead had been spent on a shadow. The light came from a brazierless iron stand set in the center of the pavilion, a crystal fixed atop it, and burning with that cold green-white fire. Around it lay 3 dead men in black lacquered armor, not fallen in battle, but left where they had dropped, each with his throat cut cleanly. Kael had time to register that much, before canvas tore behind him. He turned and caught a spear on his sword, the shock running to his shoulder. Another guard forced himself through a slit in the tent wall, sawing free of the canvas with a knife, while a third ducked under the flap with his shield already high. So that was the answer. The camp had not been empty. It had been left baited. Kael gave ground once, no more, until the crystal stand was at his back, and the 3 men had to come at him over torn rugs and overturned stools. The spearman thrust for his face. Kael beat the shaft aside, stepped in, and drove his pommel into the man's nose hard enough to fold him. The shieldman slammed into him a heartbeat later. They crashed together, boots sliding in blood and rain tracked across the carpets. Kael felt the rim bite his ribs and answered with 2 short cuts under the shield, one to the thigh, one to the groin. The man sagged. The knife man was quicker than the others. He opened Kael's sleeve and sliced the flesh of his upper arm before Kael trapped the wrist, twisted until bone cracked, and buried his sword in the man's chest. Outside, someone shouted in the enemy tongue. More boots answered. Kael tore his blade free and looked once at the cloudy silver bowl beside the crystal stand. The linen within had come loose. A child's hand, pale and impossibly small, rested above the waterline as if sleeping. For one strange instant the whole field, the king, the dead, the rain, the shouting beyond the tent, narrowed to that hand. Then the wounded shieldman lunged at his knees with a last animal effort, and Kael killed him without looking. In the moment, with Aldrin dying somewhere behind him and his wife's face rising from older ashes, reason gave way to the simpler law grief offered: leave no enemy breathing. Kael kicked through the pavilion wall into rain and smoke, found 2 more black-armored guards turning toward the breach, and hit them before they could raise a shout. He no longer fought to carve a path out. He fought to kill whatever stood in front of him, one man at a time. Beyond the baited pavilion, the camp opened around him in ordered rings of emptiness. Stakes, guy ropes, supply chests, all set with a care that made the absence worse. Men had worked here moments ago. Now only the rain remained, ticking on stretched canvas and darkening the ash underfoot. Kael moved between low fires gone to red eyes in the mud, sword up, breath measured despite the blood running warm inside his sleeve. He expected a last knot of guards, a sorcerer's circle, some crowned butcher waiting to make him pay for every step. Instead he found silence arranged with the care of a trap. At the center stood a second pavilion, larger than the rest, draped in layered black silk that thinned the daylight. No banners marked it. That, more than any sigil, told him whose tent this was. 2 bodies knelt at the entrance, hands bound behind them, heads bowed as if in prayer, until he saw the cords biting their wrists and the clean cuts across their throats. Not prisoners awaiting judgment, witnesses silenced. Kael stepped over the blood and pushed through the hanging silk. The air inside was cool and smelled of myrrh, wet wool, and fresh blood. Rugs muffled his tread. Lamps of green glass burned smokeless along the poles, casting a sickly, even light over a chamber too orderly for a battlefield. A chair of carved blackwood stood on a low dais, empty. Beside it, a narrow table held a gold circlet, a sheathed dagger sealed with wax, and a child's ivory rattle, all laid out with ceremonial care. Kael stopped. The rattle was clean, no dust, no blood, as if someone had set it there last of all. Then he heard it. Not weeping, not the thin fussing of an infant, but the small, steady breath of something alive behind the chair. Kael's grip tightened until his knuckles ached. War had taught him that sorcery liked disguises, and tyrants liked theater. He circled left, slow enough not to blunder, and looked behind the dais. In a cradle of silver lined with white fur lay a naked baby boy, pale against the dark, one tiny hand curled against his chest. His eyes were open. They rested on Kael with calm, unblinking attention that no infant should have possessed. Kael had seen children in war before. That was part of what stopped him. Not innocence. War burned that out of men early. But proportion, helplessness, the plain fact of soft flesh in a place made for iron. The child in the cradle should have been screaming at the thunder of war outside, at the smell of blood, at the cold green lamps and the dead men at the door. Instead, he lay on his back in white fur as if the pavilion were a nursery in some rich house far from the field. His skin was pale and unmarked. His eyes were dark and steady, fixed on Kael with a composure that tightened the room around them. Kael did not lower his sword. Rain tapped on the silk overhead. Somewhere beyond the tent wall, men shouted. but the sound came thin and far away. On the table beside the empty chair sat a circlet, a sealed dagger, and an ivory rattle. Regalia, token, toy, not abandoned in panic, arranged. He looked for a nurse, a hidden door, a crouched assassin behind the drapes. He found only the child and the careful order of a place emptied one breath too soon. The infant's gaze tracked him when he shifted. That was wrong enough. Worse was the absence of fear. No newborn studied a blood-soaked stranger with a soldier's patience. Kael felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that had kept him alive through ambush and night raids. When a thing made no sense on a battlefield, assume it was made that way by an enemy. Aldrin had sent him here to kill a king. He stood instead over a cradle, his dead marching behind his eyes while doubt tried to blunt his hand. He stepped closer. The boy's small fingers opened, closed once, and stilled. No cry, no flinch. Then Kael saw the thin black cord around the child's ankle, and on it a seal of dark metal no larger than a fingernail, worked in the shape of a crown. His mouth went dry. Outside, boots pounded through mud toward the pavilion. Kael understood at last that whatever lay in this cradle was not a child, and that he had already waited too long. Kael set the edge of his sword against the cradle's rim, and used his free hand to strip back the white fur. No second body lay hidden beneath it. No knife, no charm stitched into the lining. The lacquered wood was solid under his knuckles. He crouched and looked beneath the dais, into the folds of the black hangings, behind the carved chair. Nothing but shadow, rugs, and a chamber arranged for one purpose, stripped of any answer. The child watched him throughout, dark eyes following with a steadiness that made Kael's skin crawl. He rose and went to the pavilion walls. His gauntlet found seams where silk met pole, cords drawn tight, pegs hammered deep. He cut one hanging from top to bottom. Beyond it, rain, stakes, and the blurred shapes of men moving outside. No hidden passage, no screened alcove. He kicked over a chest and spilled folded robes, black and dry despite the storm. He slashed the bedding piled near the chair. Feathers burst out and clung to his vambrace. No body, no crouched servant, no hidden sorcerer. The place was too clean, as if someone had cleared it in haste after bloodshed. Kael turned back to the cradle, angrier now because the search had changed nothing.
Where is he?
He said, and hated himself at once for asking the question aloud. The infant did not startle. One small hand rested on its chest. The black seal at its ankle caught the green lamp glow with a dull, oily sheen. Kael had seen glamours before. Painted lights over marsh water. A dead scout made to seem sleeping. But glamours frayed under touch, under iron, under prayer. This thing held its shape, or wanted him to think it did. Bootsteps closed outside, disciplined and fast. Kael measured the tent in a glance. One entrance, one slit he had cut. Too many angles for spears if they rushed him together. He could seize the child, kill it, or try to break out alone. For the first time since Aldrin fell, his certainty faltered. Not from pity, from calculation. If this was a trick, it had been built for a man exactly like him. Tired, blood-hot, desperate to believe one clean stroke could still mean something. He stepped to the cradle anyway, sword lifting. The baby's unblinking gaze stayed on his face, and for an instant, Kael felt as if it understood his hesitation. The child smiled. It was not the loose, blind twitch of an infant's mouth. It was small and exact, as if it understood him. Kael felt it like cold water down his back. He had stood in shield walls while horses screamed and men drowned upright in mud. He had gone through burning gates with pitch dripping from the beams above him. Fear had always come later, if it came at all. Here, in a silk pavilion that smelled of myrrh and blood, it arrived clean and immediate. The child in the cradle knew it had stopped him. Kael's sword hovered over the black lacquer rail. He saw with sudden, ugly clarity how this would look if he struck. A veteran of Aldrin's guard butchering a naked babe while enemy witnesses poured through the door. A trap layered over the first. Kill it, and he became the butcher they would name in every hall. Spare it, and he left a danger he did not understand alive behind him. Outside, a horn gave one sharp note. Men answered close enough that he heard mail scrape on wet leather. Kael chose as he had in war before, not by certainty, but by the move that left him a way out. He snatched the gold circlet from the table, cut the wax-sealed dagger free with his thumb, and drove his boot into the side of the cradle. The lacquered frame overturned, spilling fur and child across the rugs. Still no cry. That chilled him more than the smile had. The pavilion flap burst inward. 3 black-armored soldiers came through low and fast, shields first, a 4th behind them with a hooked spear meant for legs. Kael met the first man before the line could spread, smashing the circlet into his face and ramming his sword through the gap above the shield. He tore the blade free as the second soldier slammed into him. The hooked spear bit his calf and yanked. Kael went to one knee, killed the spearman with the sealed dagger underhand, and felt the third man's axe glance off his shoulder plate hard enough to numb his arm. He gave ground toward the slit he had cut in the silk, panic pared down to a cold economy of movement. 1 man dead, 1 choking on blood, 2 still pressing. Behind them, on the white fur spilled from the overturned cradle, the infant lay on its side and watched with grave, untroubled eyes, as if the violence meant nothing to it. Kael tore through the slit in the silk with 2 men on him and a third bellowing for archers. Rain stung his face like gravel. He landed hard on the wounded leg, slid through churned mud, and barely got his sword up in time to catch the next blow. The impact jarred his shoulder and rattled his teeth. He cut low, opened 1 man from knee to groin, and drove forward before the others could close around him. The camp that had seemed empty a moment before filled from every lane between the tents. Black shields, spear points, faces set with purpose. Not a rout, not confusion. They had let him reach the heart of the camp, and now they were closing the trap. Kael drove into the nearest gap before the ring could close, using the wounded man's falling body as cover. Mud sucked at his boots. Rain flattened the camp into black canvas, red firelight, and the white flash of faces under helmets. He took a spear on his pauldron, turned with it, and cut the shaft in half. Someone shouted to take him alive. That told him more than any banner could. Whatever lay in that cradle mattered enough that they would spend men to keep word of it from friendly ears. He killed the next soldier quickly, a thrust under the chin, and shouldered past a supply cart, while arrows hissed into the wood behind him. The lanes between pavilions opened toward the main field, and with them came the sound he had been too deep in the trap to hear clearly before. Not the steady iron roar of 2 lines contesting ground, but the broken noise after a center breaks. Men were not shouting commands now. They were shouting names. Through the rain he caught scraps as he ran.
The king is down.
From one voice,
Stand at the ridge.
From another, and nearer, raw with disbelief.
Aldrin's fallen. God save us. Aldrin's fallen.
Kael missed a step. One stride only, but enough for a blade to screech across his backplate. He turned and split the attacker's face to the teeth. A knot of his own countrymen burst between the tents ahead of him, not advancing, but falling back in a ragged wedge, shields gone, one man dragging another by the straps. Their tabards were soaked so dark that the stag of Aldrin's house showed only when lightning found it. An archer he knew by sight, Heron, from the west wall at Marrow Ford, stared at Kael as if seeing a ghost.
Captain.
He gasped.
The center broke. Sir Edric's dead. They took the standard. The king.
He swallowed blood and rain together.
The king is dead. The cavalry's gone to save what they can. Run.
Kael seized him by the shoulder long enough to steady them both. Aldrin dead. The words would not fit. The old order of the world had been built on men like that enduring one more hour, one more charge, one more winter. But Heron's eyes held no confusion, only the flat knowledge of a survivor. Kael let him go. Grief would come later if there was a later. For now there was only arithmetic. A lost field. An enemy camp at his back. And too many of Aldrin's men still dying because they believed there was something left to rally to. Aldrin was dead. The fact struck harder than any mace. For one dangerous instant, Kael stood in the rain with Heron's handprint drying on his gauntlet, and saw not the field before him but a winter hall years earlier. A broad man with silver in his beard laughing over a campaign map, saying,
Kingdoms were held together by the men who did not run when the line bent.
Kael had believed him. He had built his life around that belief. Now the line had not bent. It had snapped, and the king lay somewhere in the mud behind him, while enemy horns counted the dead. A horse screamed to his left. Survival seized him by the throat and dragged him forward.
To the trees.
Not knowing whether Heron still followed. The open ground ahead was a slaughter yard, broken wagons, riderless mounts, and men crawling through trampled rye at the field's edge. Beyond it, a black fringe of pine marked the only cover within reach. Kael ran for it, limping now where the hooked spear had torn his calf. Behind him came the drumming beat of hooves. He looked once and saw 6 enemy riders breaking from the camp, black cloaks plastered to their backs, lances lowered for the chase. He veered around a dead horse and nearly went down on a shield half buried in mud. An arrow passed his ear with a sound like a wasp. Another struck the ground ahead and quivered. The riders were not merely chasing him, they were herding him away from his own retreating men, cutting him out from the flock. Kael understood the shape of it and changed course at once, angling toward a shallow gully where rainwater had eaten the field into ruts. If he could force the horses to bunch, he could kill one, maybe 2, and buy himself the trees. He slid into the gully, mud to the knee, and turned with sword in both hands. The first rider came over the lip too fast, mount checked by the drop. Kael chopped at the horse's foreleg as it hit the drop. Beast and man crashed together in a spray of filth. The second rider swerved, lance scraping Kael's pauldron, and the third cast a net weighted with iron. Kael caught one edge on his blade, but the rest wrapped his shoulders and dragged him sideways. He hit the bank hard enough to see white. Above him, through rain and mesh, black horses loomed against the gray sky, and Kael knew with a soldier's cold certainty that if he died here, what he had found in the king's tent would die with him. He rolled before the riders could pin the net, drove his sword through the mesh, and tore a gap wide enough to wrench one arm free. A lance struck the bank where his head had been. Mud filled his mouth. Kael came up on one knee and slashed at the nearest horse's muzzle. The animal reared, screaming, and the line behind it shuffled back to avoid its heavy fall. That was all he needed. He lunged up the far side of the gully, boots slipping, wounded calf burning with each step, and plunged into the rye stubble beyond. The field fell away in broken strips of trampled grain and corpses face down in the rain. Kael ran bent low, not for speed but to break his outline, making himself one more dark thing among many. He cast the wax-sealed dagger aside to free his hand, kept the sword, and counted under his breath as he crossed the ground. 5 strides straight, 3 angled. Drop, rise. Never long enough for an archer to settle. Twice arrows hissed past. Once he heard a rider crash where the earth gave way under wet turf. He did not look back. Whatever could be saved was no longer behind him. The pines rose before him in a black wall. He slipped between 2 roots black with rain and turned hard downhill, where stone and pine needles would hold less sign. Branches clawed his face. He snapped the bright stag clasp from his cloak and left the cloak hanging on a thorn bush at shoulder height. A soldier's lie to draw pursuit along the easier path. Then he waded knee-deep through a runoff stream until the cold numbed his torn leg and his tracks were gone. Only when the horns faded behind him did he stop beneath a leaning fir. He braced one hand on the trunk and fought for breath, rain ticking through the needles. Aldrin was dead. The words still would not fit inside him. Worse was the other knowledge, colder and more useful. They had hunted him not as a stray survivor, but as a witness. In the enemy king's heart tent he had found either a monstrous trick or a secret worth more than the battle itself. Kael wiped mud from his eyes, set his face south, and began to move again. The forest should have broken pursuit. Kael knew how men moved under trees after rain. Slower, louder, blind beyond 20 paces. But the sounds behind him did not scatter as they should. Horn calls came at measured intervals, never urgent, never wandering. Hounds answered from his left, then his right, not ranging wild on a scent, but holding a line. He crossed a shelf of wet stone, doubled back through a stand of fir, and dropped into a narrow wash, choked with ferns. A good path for vanishing. Before he had gone 50 paces, a dog barked ahead of him. He stopped at once. Not from fear, from calculation. He crouched behind a fallen trunk slick with moss and listened. Men behind. Men angling downslope. One hound in front, another farther off to the east. Too neat. He studied the ground through the rain-dark undergrowth and saw what he had missed while running. Old cuts on the trees, shallow and regular, made by an axe years ago. A strip of stones half buried in mud where a path had once been laid. Not wild forest. Managed land, abandoned or hidden. They were pressing him into ground strangers would not know, and locals would. The riders had not driven him from the field at random. They had turned him toward this place. If they wanted him alive, the ground ahead mattered more than speed or blood. A ravine, a ford. Somewhere a handful of men could stop one wounded fugitive and search him at leisure. He almost chose to break uphill through the hounds at once. Then he heard bridles chain rattle above the trees, and understood that mounted men were keeping pace on higher ground. Funnel below, riders above, dogs before. They had built a box and left one side open because they knew exactly where it led. He moved again, slower now, each step placed. Panic wasted breath, anger wasted time. The old path bent south between black pines and slabs of stone furred with lichen. Ahead, through the trunks, he saw a pale shape too straight to be natural. Standing stones, or the broken teeth of a wall. Unfamiliar ground, prepared ground. Kael felt the trap close not on his body, but on his choices, and that was worse. He went on anyway. Behind him, the horns kept their patient distance. In war, the road you hated was often the only one left. The old path ended without warning. One step Kael had wet stone under his boots. The next he was at the lip of a drop, toes hanging over black air. Rain hissed through the pines and vanished into the ravine below. It was not a cliff in the open, but a hidden cut in the mountain, masked by brush and the leaning bones of a ruined wall. 30 feet at least, perhaps more where the rock dropped clean. At the bottom, he saw pale stone, thorn scrub, and the dark gleam of a stream threading through them. Enough to break a man, not enough to promise death. Behind him, the hounds went quiet. That silence told him more than barking would have. They knew where he stood. He turned as 3 soldiers emerged between the trees with shields up and spears leveled. Careful now, not rushing him. A 4th came behind them, holding a crossbow low, like a man approaching a trapped wolf. Their captain wore no crest, only blackened mail and a calm face under the rain.
Yield. You are worth more breathing.
Kael's grip tightened on his sword. Worth more to whom? For the child in the cradle, for Aldrin's death, for whatever had been hidden in the enemy king's tent. He measured the men, the distance, the set of the spears, and knew the truth before pride could dress it otherwise. Wounded leg, narrow ground, crossbow ready. If they took him alive, they would strip him, question him, and learn exactly how much he had seen. He thought of his king in the mud, of the hall in winter, of the oath he had failed. A soldier's life was not his own to spend cheaply. It was, however, his to deny the enemy. He gave them one hard smile, stepped back once as if in surrender, and threw himself over the edge. The crossbow snapped. Stone slammed his shoulder, brush tore at his face, and the world became branches, rock, and impact. He hit the ravine wall shoulder first, then hip, then the back of his skull against stone hard enough to ring inside him. His sword spun from his hand into the dark. He slid the last few feet through thorn and loose shale and came to rest half in the stream, face turned to the rain. For a few breaths there was no pain at all. That frightened him more than pain. Sound returned by degrees. Water over stone. Rain tapping leaves. A far voice above the rim. Kael tried to draw breath and found the left side of his chest lagging, as if the ribs there belonged to someone else. He tasted blood and grit. When he forced his eyes open, the ravine leaned strangely. The world canted around a wedge of pale rock and black roots. He could not feel his left hand. His right twitched in the stream and closed on nothing. The grief was gone, lost days ago in ash and ruin. Yet his mind reached for it anyway. For the shape of his wife's hand. For the life that had ended before this field. Before Aldrin. Before the child in the cradle with those dry, watchful eyes. Above him, boots scraped near the edge. A man called down,
Nothing living after that.
Another answered,
Leave him. We've wasted enough.
No one sounded uncertain. No one bothered to climb down and finish it. Their voices receded with the same cold discipline that had driven him through the trees. Soon even the horses were gone, and only the rain remained. Kael lay still because he could do nothing else. He had failed his king, failed the battle, failed even to carry what he knew beyond enemy hands. Yet the last thing that held in him was not Aldrin's broken standard or the black-clad riders. It was the impossible infant beneath the pavilion lamplight, calm amid slaughter, watching him as if it had expected him. Darkness closed over the memory and took the rest.